January 17th, 1946. The desert wind carried the scent of engine oil and sun-baked aluminum across a landscape that had become a graveyard of titans. Rows upon rows of B-17 flying fortresses stretched toward the horizon, their olive-drab paint blistering under the relentless Mojave sun. These machines, which once ruled the skies over Fortress Europe, now sat silent in the dust, their propellers still, their bomb bays empty. A young mechanic named Robert Hendricks walked between them, his boots crunching on the hardpan. He had flown in these aircraft, felt their aluminum skin shudder under flak, heard their engines roar defiance at 30,000 feet. Now, he was tasked with dismantling them, piece by piece, reducing legend to scrap metal. The irony was not lost on him. In the cockpit of one fortress, he found a worn photograph wedged behind the instrument panel, a crew standing proudly before their aircraft somewhere in England, faces bright with the confidence of men who believed their machine was invincible. He wondered how many of them had made it home. The story of what happened to America's B-17 flying fortresses after World War II is not merely a tale of metal and machinery. It is a chronicle of transformation, of symbols being reinterpreted, of tools of war seeking new purpose in a world struggling to remember peace. To understand the fate of these aircraft is to understand how America itself changed in the years following victory, how abundance became burden, and how the instruments of survival were either preserved as sacred relics or consumed by the hunger of progress. When the war ended in August 1945, the United States Army Air Forces possessed over 12,700 B-17s in various conditions and locations. They were scattered across the globe, on airfields in England, France, Italy, across the Pacific Islands, in training facilities throughout the American heartland.
Each one represented an investment of nearly $250,000 in 1940s currency, embodied thousands of hours of labor, contained components manufactured by over 400,000 workers across multiple states. Yet within months of Japan's surrender, these fortresses had become obsolete, their role in history fulfilled, their future uncertain. The military planners who had orchestrated the greatest industrial mobilization in human history now faced an inverse challenge: demobilization. The machinery of war had to be dismantled as efficiently as it had been constructed. Storage facilities could not accommodate 12,000 bombers. Maintenance costs for inactive aircraft were staggering. And most critically, a new generation of military aircraft was already in development. Jets that would make the propeller-driven B-17 as archaic as the biplanes it had once replaced. The Fortress, which had seemed so modern in 1942, so technologically advanced with its Norden bombsight and remotely operated turrets, was already a relic by 1946. The men who had flown these aircraft expected different endings. They had expected parades, certainly, and there were parades. They had expected gratitude, and gratitude was offered. But they had not expected to see their fortresses, their ships, as they called them, these machines that had carried them through hell and brought them home, reduced to razor blades and cooking pots. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, a ball turret gunner who had completed 35 missions over Germany, visited the Kingman salvage yard in late 1946. He stood before the remains of a B-17 being fed into a smelter and wept openly. "We believed those planes were special," he wrote in a letter to his sister. "We believed they would last forever, like the monuments in Washington. Instead, they're being melted down and shipped to factories."
The United States government had established multiple storage and salvage facilities across the Southwest, where dry desert air would preserve aircraft better than the humid climates of the East or the salt air of coastal regions. Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona became the primary disposal center, joined by facilities at Ontario Army Airfield in California, Walnut Ridge Army Flying School in Arkansas, and Albuquerque Army Air Base in New Mexico. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation's War Assets Administration assumed control of surplus aircraft disposition, tasked with recouping as much value as possible from equipment that had cost billions to produce. Their mandate was clear: sell what could be sold, preserve what should be preserved, and scrap the rest. By early 1946, the salvage operations were in full operation. At Kingman alone, over 5,000 aircraft awaited disposition, including more than 3,000 B-17s. The process was systematic and brutal. Aircraft were categorized by condition. Those deemed airworthy or easily repairable might be sold to commercial operators or foreign governments. Those in poor condition would be stripped of valuable components: engines, instruments, radio equipment, anything that retained utility or value. The remainder would be smelted, the aluminum reclaimed and sold to manufacturing companies hungry for raw materials. A fully scrapped B-17 yielded approximately 13.5 tons of aluminum, along with smaller quantities of copper, steel, and other metals. At 1946 scrap prices, this generated roughly $1,600 per aircraft, less than 1% of the original manufacturing cost. The men who performed this work were often veterans themselves, former aircraft mechanics who knew every rivet and cable in these machines. They approached their task with conflicting emotions. There was pride in efficiency, in the craft of careful disassembly.
There was pragmatism. These were jobs in an economy flooded with returning servicemen, and work was work. But there was also sadness, a sense of participating in something that felt like desecration. The metaphor captured the agricultural mindset of many who had grown up in Depression-era America, where waste was sin and every tool was maintained until it could no longer serve. Yet not all fortresses were destined for the smelter. The B-17's reputation as a stable, reliable aircraft with enormous cargo capacity made it attractive for civilian conversion. The war had demonstrated that long-range aviation was commercially viable, and entrepreneurs saw opportunity in surplus bombers. Companies like the Bendix Corporation, Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation, and dozens of smaller operators purchased B-17s and converted them for civilian use. The military equipment was stripped away, turrets removed, bomb bays sealed or converted to cargo holds, additional fuel tanks installed, seating added for passengers, or space configured for freight. These conversions were registered with the Civil Aeronautics Administration, painted in bright commercial liveries, and put to work. Some became firefighting aircraft, modified to carry thousands of gallons of water or fire retardant. Fitted with belly tanks and drop mechanisms, these fortresses found new purpose battling wildfires across the American West. The characteristics that had made them excellent bombers, stability, reliability, ability to operate from rough fields, made them equally effective as aerial firefighters. By the late 1940s, converted B-17s were standard equipment in the Forest Service's aerial firefighting program, their bellies painted red instead of olive drab, their crews consisting of civilian pilots who navigated mountain thermals instead of enemy flak. Others became airborne laboratories. The scientific community recognized that the B-17's spacious fuselage, high-altitude capability, and stability made it ideal for research. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, predecessor to NASA, operated several B-17s as test platforms for new technologies. Universities used them for atmospheric research, meteorological studies, and early experiments in airborne radar. The United States Weather Bureau operated a fleet of modified fortresses for hurricane reconnaissance, flying directly into tropical storms to gather data that ground stations could never obtain. These aircraft, designated WB-17s by the military, continued flying dangerous missions, not over Berlin or Schweinfurt, but into the eyes of hurricanes sweeping across the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. The commercial cargo carriers that emerged in the post-war period found the B-17 particularly valuable for serving remote locations and island communities. In Alaska, small airlines used them to transport supplies to mining camps and indigenous villages unreachable by road. Across the Pacific, they moved goods between island groups, their long range making them practical for transoceanic hops that smaller aircraft could not manage. The fortress's legendary durability proved equally valuable in peace as in war. Engines could tolerate rough maintenance, airframes could absorb hard landings on improvised strips, and mechanical redundancies meant that failures rarely resulted in total loss of the aircraft.
But these civilian applications absorbed only a fraction of the surplus. By 1947, perhaps 400 B-17s had found second lives in commercial or research roles. Another 500 were transferred to allied nations through military assistance programs. Brazil, France, the United Kingdom, and other countries received B-17s for various purposes: maritime patrol, training, transport.
Some saw combat again in regional conflicts. Others served quietly in supporting roles until age and wear mandated their retirement. The remainder, more than 11,000 aircraft, faced the smelter or long-term storage. The United States military did retain a number of fortresses for specialized purposes. The Air Rescue Service operated SB-17s equipped with lifeboats that could be dropped to downed crews or shipwreck survivors. The Navy used PB-1Ws, modified B-17s fitted with early warning radar, as airborne picket ships designed to extend radar coverage around fleet formations. The Coast Guard employed them for maritime patrol and search and rescue operations. These military B-17s continued serving into the 1950s, but their numbers steadily declined as purpose-built aircraft replaced these adapted bombers. The symbolism of the B-17's fate was not lost on contemporary observers. Here was the weapon that had carried American power into the heart of Nazi Germany, that had demonstrated democratic resolve could be translated into industrial capacity and strategic bombardment. These aircraft had represented a promise that American resources and technology could overcome tyranny, that free people could produce instruments of liberation faster and better than authoritarian regimes. Yet within a year of victory, they were being reduced to ingots, their aluminum cycling back into the civilian economy to become automobiles, washing machines, building materials. The transformation was complete, instruments of destruction becoming tools of domestic prosperity. Some Americans found this cycle beautiful, seeing in it the validation of fighting for a return to normal life. The B-17s had done their job, now their materials would build the post-war world. But others, particularly veterans, experienced it as loss. The fortresses had been more than machines.
They had been homes at 30,000 feet, refuges in hostile skies, extensions of crew relationships and collective survival. Each aircraft had personality, quirks in handling, tendencies in flight, characteristics as distinct as human temperament. Crews named their fortresses, painted nose art, developed superstitions about their aircraft's luck. To see them anonymously dismantled suggested that the experiences they represented were equally disposable. A few fortresses escaped both scrapping and utilitarian conversion, preserved instead as monuments. The Army Air Forces recognized that some aircraft should be saved for their historical significance. B-17s that had completed exceptional numbers of missions or participated in significant operations were set aside. The most famous was the Memphis Belle, which had completed 25 missions over Europe in 1943 and returned to the United States for a war bond tour. After the war, it was placed in storage and eventually became part of the Air Force Museum collection. Similar aircraft were preserved at various military installations, static displays that would remind future generations of what had been accomplished. Museums and veterans organizations also sought to preserve fortresses. The process was haphazard. There was no coordinated preservation program in the immediate post-war years, no systematic effort to save representative examples of different variants or configurations. Preservation happened through individual initiative, local advocacy, or fortunate circumstance. Some B-17s survived simply because they were abandoned in remote locations and forgotten, their airframes deteriorating slowly in isolation until rediscovered decades later. Others were saved by individuals who recognized historical value and fought bureaucratic indifference to prevent their scrapping. The 1950s brought renewed interest in the B-17 as Cold War tensions reminded Americans of previous conflicts.
The Korean War prompted some military leaders to suggest returning B-17s to service. Their bomb capacity and altitude ceiling remained relevant, and thousands still existed in storage. But technology had advanced too far. Jet-powered bombers like the B-47 represented a generational leap that made propeller-driven aircraft militarily obsolete, despite their battlefield capability. Instead, the B-17's legacy influenced design philosophy for new aircraft, with emphasis on crew survivability, defensive armament, and the concept of self-defending bomber formations that the Fortress had pioneered. Hollywood's embrace of World War II narratives in the 1950s and 1960s restored the B-17 to public consciousness. Films like 12 O'Clock High and The War Lover featured fortresses prominently, using surviving aircraft as platforms for recreating bomber missions. These films, while dramatized, conveyed to post-war generations what the strategic bombing campaign had demanded from crews and aircraft. The B-17 became cinematic shorthand for American air power, its distinctive shape instantly recognizable, its presence in frame signaling sacrifice and determination. By the 1960s, surviving airworthy B-17s had become rare enough to be valuable. Aviation enthusiasts and warbird collectors began acquiring and restoring fortresses, often spending years and hundreds of thousands of dollars returning them to flight status. These restored aircraft appeared at air shows, living history demonstrations that allowed younger generations to see and hear what their grandparents had known. The sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines at full power became a nostalgic echo, a mechanical voice from a different America. The men who had flown these aircraft aged alongside their machines. Veteran organizations held reunions where former crew members shared stories and memories, their narratives preserving details that official histories overlooked.
They spoke of the smell of hydraulic fluid and high-octane gasoline, the vibration that shook every rivet at altitude, the cold that penetrated heated suits, the fear that became routine, and the routine that became sacred. They remembered specific fortresses, not by designation numbers, but by names: Liberty Lady, Sentimental Journey, 909. Each name carrying weight of experience that outsiders could never fully comprehend. The B-17's post-war story reflects broader American patterns of memory and forgetting. The immediate post-war years emphasized moving forward, building prosperity, leaving wartime experiences behind. Veterans were expected to reintegrate quietly, to exchange uniform for civilian clothes, and resume normal life as if years of combat were merely interruption. The fortresses, likewise, were expected to disappear gracefully into their next purpose, whether as cargo haulers or aluminum ingots. But as time created distance, nostalgia grew. What had seemed disposable in 1946 became precious by 1966, when the lived experience of World War II was fading and the symbolic meaning of its artifacts intensified. Environmental considerations eventually grounded most surviving B-17s still in civilian operation. Modern safety standards, insurance costs, and parts scarcity made operating 70-year-old aircraft increasingly impractical for commercial purposes. The last B-17 firefighters were retired in the 1970s, replaced by purpose-built aircraft with greater capacity and safety features. The weather recognition fortresses gave way to jets that could fly higher and faster. The cargo haulers were supplanted by more economical aircraft with better performance. One by one, the working B-17s transitioned to museums or private collections, their utilitarian phase ending as their symbolic importance increased. Today, fewer than 50 B-17s remain in existence, with perhaps a dozen in airworthy condition.
Each represents countless hours of restoration labor, ongoing maintenance challenges, and substantial financial investment. They are cared for by volunteers and professional restorers who understand they are not merely preserving aircraft, but maintaining tangible connections to historical experience. When a restored B-17 flies overhead at an airshow, the sound triggers memories in diminishing numbers of veterans and creates curiosity in generations who know that sound only through simulation. The fortress became a symbol, but symbols are reinterpreted across time. To those who flew them, B-17s represented survival, the aircraft that brought them home despite damage that should have been fatal, the machines that absorbed punishment meant for human bodies. To the generation that built them, they represented American industrial achievement, proof that democracy's dispersed economic system could outproduce authoritarian central planning. To post-war Americans, they represented victory and the cost of victory, the sacrifice that purchased decades of peace and prosperity. To contemporary Americans, they represent a vanished world, when conflicts seemed clearer
and national purpose more unified. Yet the physical destruction of most B-17s after the war reminds us that material things, no matter how significant, are ultimately temporary. The aluminum that once formed a fortress's wing might now be part of a commercial airliner, an office building's facade, a beverage can. The materials cycled through the economy, serving new purposes, creating new value. The fortress as object disappeared, but the fortress as idea persisted, captured in photographs, preserved in veteran testimony, reconstructed in histories, embodied in the few surviving aircraft that still fly. There is poetry in this transformation, though it is melancholy poetry. The machines built to deliver destruction became instruments of creation, their materials repurposed for peacetime abundance.
The fortresses that had filled enemy skies with terror filled American homes with prosperity. The cycle was intentional, the planned obsolescence of war materials funding the expansion of civilian life. This was not waste, but metamorphosis, the beating of swords into plowshares enacted through industrial process rather than biblical metaphor. Robert Hendricks, the mechanic who had walked among grounded fortresses in Kingman, eventually left the salvage yard and enrolled in college on the GI Bill. He became an engineer, designing components for commercial aircraft. In 1982, he attended an air show and watched a restored B-17 perform a flyby. The sound transported him instantly. He was 23 again, feeling the bomber shudder as flak burst nearby, watching the bombardier line up on the target, experiencing the mix of terror and duty that defined his war. After the show, he approached the aircraft, ran his hand along the aluminum skin, warm from the desert sun. "We thought you were invincible," he said quietly, speaking to the machine as if to an old friend. "And maybe you were." The fate of America's B-17 flying fortresses after World War II was not a single story, but thousands of stories, each aircraft's path unique, each ending different. Some died in scrapyards, some perished in crashes, some served decades in obscurity, and some became celebrated artifacts of national heritage. But collectively, their story reflects the nature of tools and symbols, the difference between material permanence and conceptual endurance. The fortresses as physical objects were consumed by time, economics, and progress. The fortress as symbol endures, representing not just the aircraft itself, but the era that built it, the men who flew it, and the nation that believed such machines could secure freedom. In the end, perhaps it was fitting that most B-17s did not survive as monuments, but returned to the industrial cycle that had created them.
They were, after all, products of industrial democracy, machines conceived by designers, financed by taxpayers, built by workers, maintained by mechanics, flown by ordinary citizens trained for extraordinary tasks. Their creation and their dissolution were both democratic processes, collective decisions about resource allocation and national priorities. The fortresses served when needed and were released when that need passed, neither hoarded nor needlessly preserved, but allowed to transform as America itself transformed, from wartime mobilization to peacetime prosperity. The few that remain serve as ambassadors from that time, physical presences that make history tangible. When they fly, they carry not just fuel and crew, but accumulated memory of missions over Germany, of crews lost, of targets destroyed, of a younger nation learning what its values demanded and what its power could achieve. The sound of their engines is a voice from the past, speaking of sacrifice and purpose, of the terrible calculus of strategic bombardment, of the men who climbed into aluminum cockpits, knowing the odds, but climbing anyway. And in museums and at air shows, in the photographs veterans keep until their final days, in the stories passed to children and grandchildren, the fortress endures, not as it was, but as it means, a symbol of a specific moment when American abundance was weaponized for the preservation of freedom, when industrial capacity became strategic advantage, when machines and men together attempted the impossible and, for all their losses, succeeded. That success made their own obsolescence possible, made the world safe enough that bombers could become firefighters,
and their aluminum could build suburbs instead of armadas. In that transformation lies the true victory, not the battles won, but the peace that made those battles the last of their kind, at least until the next time abundance and democracy would again require defense.
The fortresses are gone, most of them, reduced to their elements and redistributed across the landscape of prosperity they helped secure. But they remain present in the architecture of memory, in the structure of how we understand that war and its aftermath, in the recognition that even the mightiest machines are only temporary vessels for permanent truths about courage, sacrifice, and the price of the world we inhabit. That is what happened to America's B-17 flying fortresses after World War II. They became what they always were beneath the aluminum and engines. Stories we tell ourselves about who we were and who we hoped to become.